The winter of 1885 descended upon the Arizona Territory with unprecedented ferocity. In these unforgiving lands, where survival required iron will and careful preparation, a single act of defiance against fear and prejudice would reshape relationships between two peoples forever. This is the extraordinary story of Clara Whitmore, a determined frontier widow, and the choice she made when she found a dying enemy at her doorstep, a choice that would bring 70 warriors to her land in spring, carrying gifts beyond imagination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. November winds howled across the Mogollon Rim, carrying the bitter promise of the harshest winter anyone could remember. Clara Whitmore stood at her cabin window, her weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of chicory coffee, watching dark clouds gather over the distant mountains. At 43, she had survived 8 Arizona winters alone since her husband Thomas died. But something about this approaching season felt different, more threatening, more absolute. The small ranch she maintained lay 15 miles south of Fort Apache, positioned at the edge of where white settlement gave way to Apache territory. Most considered her location foolishly isolated, but Clara had chosen it deliberately. The land here was rich, with year-round springs and natural shelter in the carved canyons. She raised enough cattle and chickens to sustain herself and maintained a small vegetable garden that somehow prospered despite the altitude. This morning brought alarming news. James Morrison, her nearest neighbor 20 miles east, had ridden through the previous evening with warnings. Apache scouts were active in the area, not raiding parties, but individual messengers moving between bands. The territorial governor had declared a state of heightened alert, following some incident near the Salt River that Clara hadn't fully understood from Morrison's fractured account. "You should come stay at the settlement until spring," Morrison had urged, tipping his hat against the wind, "especially with tensions rising. A woman alone out here, it ain't safe." Clara had thanked him politely and declined, as she did every winter. She had spent too many years building this place to abandon it now. Besides, the Apache had never troubled her directly. Her late husband had maintained strict neutrality during tribal conflicts, trading fairly with anyone who approached peacefully. She honored that practice, keeping her rifle close but never raising it unless absolutely necessary. By afternoon, the first snow began falling, not the gentle flurries she usually saw this early in November, but heavy, wet flakes that promised accumulation. Clara moved quickly to complete her winter preparations. She checked the barn where she had stored hay for her 3 horses and 4 cattle. The woodpile stood 12 feet high along the cabin's north wall, enough for 3 months, if she was careful. In the root cellar, shelves held rows of preserved vegetables, dried meat, and sacks of flour and beans purchased during her last trip to Fort Apache in September. As dusk approached, she performed her evening ritual, checking the animals, securing the chicken coop, and drawing water from the well before the coming night freeze. The temperature had dropped dramatically as the sun declined, and her breath formed clouds as she worked. In the barn, her horses whinnied restlessly, sensing the approaching storm. It was during her final trip from the well, struggling against wind-driven snow that now fell horizontally, that Clara noticed the shape near her woodpile. At first she thought it might be a wolf seeking shelter. Large predators sometimes approached the cabin during severe weather. But as she drew closer, lantern raised high, she realized with shock that it was a human figure, collapsed and partially buried by the rapidly accumulating snow. Her first instinct was to retreat into the cabin and bolt the door. Territorial tensions had everyone on edge, and a stranger appearing at her isolated homestead after dark could mean any number of threats. But as she hesitated, Something about the figure's stillness struck her. This wasn't someone lying in wait. This was someone who had fallen and couldn't rise. Clara set the lantern down carefully and approached, her hand resting on the butt of the pistol she always carried. The figure was dressed in buckskin, poorly suited for the worsening weather. As she knelt beside him, clearly a man by his size, she could see his lips were tinged blue and his breathing was shallow and labored. More concerning were the dark stains on his clothing that could only be blood. Without thinking further, Clara made a decision that went against everything her neighbors would have counseled. She couldn't let anyone die outside her door, regardless of who they might be or what conflicts divided their peoples. Thomas had always said that basic humanity transcended politics, and Clara had never found reason to doubt that principle. Getting the man inside proved more challenging than she had anticipated. He was completely unconscious, tall and solidly built, probably outweighing her by 70 pounds. The snow made everything slippery, and her first attempt to lift him only succeeded in sliding him a few inches toward the cabin. The storm was intensifying, and she knew she had to act quickly or risk freezing herself. Clara ran to the barn and returned with a length of canvas and rope. She managed to roll the unconscious man onto the canvas, then secured it around him. Using the rope as a pull line, she was able to drag him across the snow to her cabin door. The final challenge came in maneuvering him up the 2 wooden steps and through the narrow doorway, a process that required several minutes of careful pulling and repositioning. Once inside, Clara didn't pause to catch her breath. She quickly examined him by lamplight, noting that he was Apache. His clothing, jewelry, and facial features made that clear. He wore a quiver but no bow, suggesting he wasn't a warrior on a war party. More puzzling was a small leather pouch secured around his neck that looked deliberately protected, as if it contained something important. The blood came from a wound in his shoulder, not from a bullet or arrow, but what appeared to be a knife cut. It had been bandaged with strips of cloth, but the bandage had failed and needed replacement. Clara had treated similar injuries before. Frontier life demanded basic medical knowledge. Working efficiently, she built up the fire and began heating water. She found her medical supplies, donated by the army doctor during her last fort visit, and set them out on the kitchen table. The man needed warmth, treatment for his wound, and probably hadn't eaten recently based on his gaunt appearance. As Clara worked, she wondered what circumstances had brought this Apache messenger, for that's clearly what he was, to collapse. Outside her cabin, the territorial situation had grown increasingly complex over recent months. The Apache were being pressured to relocate to reservations, with various factions responding differently to government demands. Some submitted peacefully, others resisted, and many simply tried to maintain traditional ways while navigating an impossible situation. Perhaps this man carried important communications between tribal leaders. Perhaps he had been attacked by other Apache from rival factions or by white settlers enforcing their own version of frontier justice. Clara didn't know, but she recognized that by bringing him inside and treating his wounds, she had made a decision that would have consequences. While the water heated, she removed the man's outer garments carefully, noting their quality. Atatu, buckskin, had been expertly crafted, decorated with intricate beadwork that suggested someone of importance. His moccasins showed hard wear, but had been well maintained. Everything about his appearance indicated a person of status within his community. The wound cleaning proved difficult without assistance. Infection had already begun to set in, requiring thorough irrigation and the application of carbolic acid, a process that caused the unconscious man to moan and shift restlessly. Clara worked steadily, her hands remembering the procedures she had performed on Thomas after his horse accident, and later on herself after various mishaps. By midnight, she had accomplished what she could medically. The wound was cleaned, treated with iodine, and properly bandaged. She had given him small doses of laudanum dissolved in water to manage pain, though getting the unconscious patient to swallow required patience and persistence. Now came decisions about the immediate future. Clara positioned several thick blankets near the stove, creating a more comfortable resting place than the wooden floor. She moved the unconscious Apache onto these blankets, ensuring his injured shoulder remained elevated to reduce swelling. The storm showed no signs of abating. Through her window, she could see snow accumulating rapidly, already measuring several inches. By morning, travel would be impossible. Even if she had wanted to notify authorities or seek help, she was effectively isolated for the duration of this weather system. Clara spent the next 3 hours monitoring her unexpected patient. She added wood to the fire regularly, checked his breathing and pulse, and attempted to get him to take small amounts of water. Around 3 in the morning, she allowed herself to sit in her rocking chair, rifle across her lap, and consider what she had done. Harboring an Apache during heightened tensions could be considered treason by some. The territorial government had recently enacted strict policies regarding interaction with tribal members outside official channels. By treating his wounds and providing shelter, Clara had probably violated multiple regulations. If discovered, she could face arrest, loss of her homestead, or worse. Yet as she watched the man's chest rise and fall steadily, she found no regret in her decision. She had acted according to principles that had guided her since childhood, principles that her parents had instilled and that Thomas had shared. All human beings deserved basic dignity, especially when helpless and suffering. Dawn arrived grey and cold, with snow still falling heavily. Clara had managed perhaps 2 hours of sleep in her chair. She checked on her patient first. His breathing had improved, though he remained unconscious. The wound would need attention again, and she suspected he hadn't eaten in days based on his condition. After stoking the fire and adding coffee to her morning routine, Clara ventured outside to check on her animals. The storm had dumped 6 inches of snow overnight, with deep drifts against the buildings. Her breath caught in her throat as she noted something she hadn't considered. There were now tracks in the snow leading directly from where she had found the Apache to her cabin door. Anyone, passing, unlikely as that was in this weather, would see clear evidence that someone had been dragged to her home. The tracks hadn't yet filled completely with fresh snow, meaning they were relatively recent and obvious. Clara used a broom to obscure the most telling signs, but knew that careful observers could still deduce what had happened. Inside the barn, her animals seemed agitated, perhaps sensing the presence of a stranger or simply responding to the storm's intensity. She fed them quickly, gathered eggs from the chicken coop, and noted that she would need to ration feed carefully if this weather continued. Her planned winter supplies would now need to support 2 people instead of 1. Returning to the cabin, Clara found her patient beginning to show signs of consciousness. His eyelids fluttered occasionally, and he muttered words in his native language during periods of restlessness. She had prepared a simple broth from chicken bones and dried vegetables, keeping it simmering gently on the stove. Around mid-morning, the Apache's eyes finally opened fully. His initial reaction was one of confusion, followed by wariness as he took in his surroundings. When his gaze fell on Clara, sitting nearby with her rifle resting against the wall, but within reach, his hand moved instinctively toward his neck, checking for the leather pouch she had noticed earlier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Clara spoke first, keeping her voice calm and non-threatening. "You were outside my cabin yesterday evening, nearly frozen. You needed help." The man attempted to sit up, then winced as the movement stressed his injured shoulder. He studied her face carefully before speaking in heavily accented but clear English. "You are alone? My husband died several years ago. Yes, I live alone. Why help Apache? His question carried genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Clara considered her answer carefully. "Because you were dying in my yard. Same reason I'd help anyone." He nodded slowly, perhaps appreciating the straightforward response. "I am called Soaring Hawk. I carry message between tribes. Important message. I'm Clara Whitmore. Your shoulder was badly infected. You'll need several days of rest before you can travel." Soaring Hawk's expression showed concern at this information. "How many days?" "Depends on the weather and how quickly you heal. This storm may last another day or two. Then you'll need strength to navigate what looks to be a serious winter setting early this year." She could see him processing this information, weighing his need to complete his mission against his physical limitations. Finally, he nodded acceptance. "Mrs. Whitmore, if soldiers come looking, they won't find you during this storm. After, that will determine what's best." This seemed to satisfy him for the moment. Clara brought him a bowl of the broth she had prepared, watching as he sipped gratefully despite obvious discomfort from his shoulder. "The pouch around your neck," she ventured. "Messages for tribal leaders." Soaring Hawk touched the leather pouch protectively but didn't remove it. Words from chiefs to other chiefs, about treaty talks, about survival. The weight in his voice suggested that whatever message he carried held significant importance for his people. Clara didn't press further, recognizing that tribal communications remained beyond her understanding or involvement. As she watched Soaring Hawk manage his second bowl of broth, Clara realized that her winter had just become far more complicated than she had anticipated. She had committed herself to sheltering an Apache messenger during a time of rising tensions. Her isolated cabin had become a sanctuary for someone whose very presence could bring serious consequences. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, effectively sealing them together in circumstances neither had chosen. The fireplace crackled warmly, creating a comforting contrast to the howling wind that promised many more hours, perhaps days, of confinement. Clara returned to her routine tasks, conscious that her every movement was now observed by someone from a culture she knew primarily through distant encounters and second-hand accounts. She wondered what Soaring Hawk thought of her modest home, her simple possessions, her solitary life on land that had once belonged exclusively to his people. By afternoon, as the storm showed no signs of weakening and snow continued to accumulate, Clara began to recognize that this situation was unlike any she had previously faced on the frontier. She had crossed a line between cultures in the most intimate way possible, bringing a traditional enemy into her home, treating his wounds, sharing her food and shelter. There would be no going back to simple isolation now. Whatever happened next, her actions during this storm would define her relationship not just with Soaring Hawk, but potentially with the broader conflicts dividing the territory. As darkness fell on her second day with an Apache messenger under her roof, Clara Whitmore began to understand that some decisions once made reshaped the entire landscape of a life. The winter that had arrived with unusual force was demanding unusual responses. She had answered that demand with an act of basic humanity that might prove either her greatest mistake or her most important contribution to a divided land. The snow continued falling, binding two people from different worlds together in a cabin that suddenly felt smaller than it had during 8 previous winters of solitude. The third morning brought a subtle change. The storm had finally exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind a landscape transformed by 3 feet of pristine snow. Clara woke to find her patient attempting to stand, clearly testing his strength. She had learned to recognize the determined set of his jaw that meant he was about to do something despite physical limitations. "The healing won't speed up because you're restless," she observed, setting down the coffee pot she had carried to the table. Soaring Hawk paused, halfway between sitting and standing, then settled back with visible reluctance. "I have been still for too long. My people wait for the message." Clara poured him coffee, noting how he accepted the gesture with surprise that quickly transformed into appreciation. "Your people will benefit more from receiving their message from a living messenger than from recovering your body when the snow melts." This directness seemed to amuse him. The corners of his mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile before he caught himself. "In my language," he said, switching to careful English, "you would be called straight-speaking woman." "Not meant as an insult. I'll take that as the compliment it was intended to be," Clara replied. She had noticed that his English improved when he relaxed, suggesting more familiarity with the language than he initially revealed. Over the next hour, a tentative routine emerged. Clara prepared a more substantial breakfast than the broths of previous days, cornbread with preserved peaches and strips of dried beef. She watched Soaring Hawk navigate the meal with quiet efficiency, noting how he tested each unfamiliar food cautiously before proceeding. "Where did you learn English?" she asked, genuinely curious about his background. "Mission school, when I was boy, before troubles began." His expression darkened briefly. "My grandfather say knowledge of enemy words gives strength. Some knowledge helps the tribe survive." Clara recognized wisdom in that perspective, though she wondered what experiences had shaped such pragmatic thinking. "Your grandfather sounds like a thoughtful man." "Was. Died last winter. Very old, very wise." Soaring. Hawk looked toward the window where morning light reflected brilliantly off snow. "He would say this storm was spirit intervention, that I was meant to find help here. Perhaps he would. Though I prefer to think people make their own choices, with or without spirit guidance." This prompted a more definite smile from Soaring Hawk. "Grandfather would like how you speak. Always question those who claim spirits, tell them what to do. Said spirits expect people to think for themselves." Their conversation was interrupted by a distant sound that made Soaring Hawk instantly alert. Hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Clara recognized them too, a single horse moving carefully but deliberately toward her cabin. "Get back to bed," she instructed quietly. "Look sick if you can manage it." Soaring Hawk immediately complied, settling into the blankets and assuming a convincingly weakened posture. Clara checked that his quiver and any other identifying items were out of sight, then moved to her rocking chair where she could reach her rifle without appearing defensive. The rider turned out to be Jim Hawkins, the 18-year-old son of a ranching family 25 miles northeast. He was blue-lipped and shivering when Clara opened her door, clearly having struggled through deep snow to reach her cabin. "Mrs. Whitmore, ma'am," he managed through chattering teeth. "Father sent me to check on you after the storm," said a woman. "Alone might need help." Clara appreciated the concern while recognizing the timing's inconvenience. "That's very kind, Jim. Please come in and warm yourself before you head back." As the young man entered, stamping snow from his boots, Clara was acutely aware of Soaring Hawk feigning sleep nearby. From casual observation, he might appear to be any traveler who had sought shelter. His distinctive clothing was covered by blankets, and his injury positioned him so that only his profile was visible from the door. "Coffee's hot," she offered, hoping normal hospitality would expedite the visit. "How bad were the roads coming in?" "Terrible, ma'am. Took me near 3 hours, which usually takes 40 minutes. Jim gratefully accepted the steaming cup. His gaze wandered naturally around the cabin, taking in details as any visitor might. When his eyes settled on the sleeping figure by the fire, Clara explained with practiced casualness, "Found a traveler near frozen outside my door yesterday. Been nursing him back to health. That's Christian of you, ma'am." Jim's attention seemed satisfied. "Father figured you might have had folks seek shelter. He said to tell you we'll be checking the pass road tomorrow if this weather holds." should be able to get supplies through by week's end. This information about improved travel conditions created both relief and concern. While supplies would be welcome, increased movement meant higher risk of discovery. Tell your father I'm grateful for the concern. I'm well stocked through winter, but the company will be appreciated when roads clear. Jim finished his coffee, quickly, eager to return home before the weather might change again. Clara walked him to the door, maintaining friendly conversation until he mounted his horse and disappeared into the snow-covered landscape. When she returned inside, soaring, Hawk had emerged from his blankets, his previously relaxed demeanor replaced by alert wariness. That was skillfully managed, he observed, studying her with new interest. Simple necessity. Jim's a good young man, but there are others who might react differently to finding an Apache in my cabin. Soaring Hawk nodded thoughtfully. You protected me from your own people. Why? The question, asked with genuine confusion, struck Clara as profoundly sad. Because it was the right thing to do. Should I have done otherwise? Many would have done. I carry scars from those who thought differently. Clara found herself wanting to know more, but recognized that pushing for details might close the door that had just opened. Instead, she continued with her morning routine, noting how Soaring Hawk began observing her daily tasks with obvious interest. The chickens, he said as she prepared to gather eggs. They need care in such weather. Every day, storm or not. They're dependent on me for survival. May I help? The movement would be good for my shoulder. Clara hesitated, considering the risk of having him outside. But the request seemed genuine, and his healing would benefit from mild activity. Dress warm. The barn is sheltered, but the cold is severe. Together, they ventured outside, soaring, Hawk moving awkwardly in borrowed coat and extra blankets. Clara showed him how she had arranged the chicken coop for winter, straw for warmth, protected food and water containers, carefully maintained ventilation that prevented both freezing and suffocation. As they worked, she noticed his growing fascination with her practical arrangements. You study everything, she observed. Everything here is different from the Apache way, but not wrong. Just different solutions to same problems. He helped distribute feed with careful movements that favored his injured shoulder. My grandmother kept chickens once, before relocation. Demands. This mention of relocation opened the door to broader conversation. As they moved between chores, gathering eggs, checking water sources, refilling feed containers, Soaring Hawk shared more details about current tribal challenges. Government makes promises, then changes them. Says Apache must live in specific places, but those places have no game, poor soil for growing. People who lived freely for generations, now supposed to become farmers in one season. His voice carried frustration carefully controlled. Some tribes submit, others resist. My message concerns those who seek a middle path. Cooperation where possible, preservation of ways where necessary. Clara listened carefully as they returned to the cabin. Arms full of fresh eggs and observations about intertribal politics she had never previously understood. Your message could help prevent conflict? She asked, once they were warming by the fire. Could help prevent unnecessary conflict. Some fighting may be unavoidable as peoples adjust to changes, but communication between tribal leaders might preserve more lives, more culture. This perspective on his mission gave Clara new appreciation for why Soaring Hawk had been so concerned about delays. These weren't merely tribal communications, they were potentially diplomatic negotiations that could affect hundreds of lives. Then we need to focus on getting you healthy enough to travel safely. Soaring Hawk nodded agreement, settling back near the fire with visible relief. The morning's activity had tired him more than he'd initially admitted, but Clara noticed increased mobility in his shoulder. The afternoon brought a different kind of shared experience. As Clara worked on mending clothes, a necessary winter task she'd been postponing, Soaring Hawk observed with interest until he began offering suggestions about different stitching techniques. Apache women use this method for repairs, he demonstrated, awkwardly with his uninjured arm, stronger than a single thread. The demonstration led to Clara attempting his technique, then teaching him her methods in return. Soon they were sharing practical knowledge across cultural boundaries, how to preserve leather in humid conditions, which local plants provided, the best dyes, optimal ways to store different types of seeds through winter. Among my people, Soaring Hawk shared as they worked, such exchange would be considered gift-making. Knowledge given freely creates an obligation for the receiver to share knowledge in return. I like that custom. It builds connections rather than debts. By evening, their interaction had shifted noticeably from guarded cooperation to something approaching friendship. Clara prepared their supper, root vegetables from the cellar, preserved meat and fresh cornbread, while Soaring Hawk told stories about his travels as a messenger. The hardest part, he admitted over the meal, is carrying information about conflicts between bands. Sometimes, peaceful tribes ask for news of relatives forced onto reservations, families divided by policies they don't understand. Clara had never considered this human cost of territorial changes. Do you have a family on reservations? Some cousins, they adapt as they must, but it breaks connection to ancestral places, to seasonal movement that kept our people healthy for generations. His explanation provided context for tensions she had observed only from a distance. Living alone, at the edge of settled territory, Clara had witnessed increased patrol activity and heard rumors of conflicts, but without understanding the underlying human cost. The ranchers around here worry constantly about Apache raids, she said carefully, but we rarely see actual problems. Mostly it's fear of the unknown. Fear serves many purposes, Soaring Hawk replied diplomatically. Sometimes protects, sometimes prevents understanding. My journey exists because some leaders see that understanding might be stronger protection than fear. As darkness fell, they settled into what had become evening routine. Clara mending or reading, while Soaring Hawk carved small objects from wood scraps she had provided, a skill that helped his shoulder mobility while producing useful items. Tomorrow, Clara announced, we should check that shoulder wound more carefully. It's been 3 days, and the bandage needs changing regardless. Soaring Hawk nodded agreement, though she noticed his slight tension at the prospect. Cultural barriers still existed around physical care between strangers, particularly across gender and ethnic lines. I've treated wounds before, she assured him. My husband Thomas had several accidents during our ranching years. I learned from necessity. This mention of her deceased husband prompted a question from Soaring Hawk that had clearly been building. Your husband, he is buried near here? 1/4 mile east, under the big cottonwood. Thomas chose the spot himself after we built the cabin, said it overlooked the best views of his favorite land. He was a good man. The best. Fair in dealings, honest in communication, strong when needed but never cruel. He would have helped you, just as I did. Soaring Hawk considered this carefully. Such people are rare in any culture. They build bridges others fear to cross. That evening, as Clara prepared her sleeping area and Soaring Hawk arranged his blankets by the fire, he offered an observation that indicated how much had changed since his arrival. 3 days ago, I expected to die in snow outside a strange white woman's cabin. Tonight, I understand that woman sees people, not enemies. Your husband chose well when he married you. The compliment, delivered with Apache directness, touched Clara more than flowery words would have. Kindness doesn't require courage when it's simply the right choice, she replied. In my experience, Soaring Hawk said carefully, the right choice often requires the greatest courage. As they settled for the night, Clara reflected on how dramatically her understanding had expanded over mere days. The Apache messenger who had collapsed near her woodpile had transformed from potential threat to actual person, someone carrying responsibilities, maintaining relationships, working to prevent conflicts while navigating an impossible political landscape. More significantly, she recognized that she had discovered something she hadn't realized she missed: intellectual companionship. Conversations with visitors usually focused on weather, livestock, or local gossip. Soaring Hawk's perspectives introduced her to concepts and concerns she had never considered. The fourth day dawned clear and bright, with sunlight creating diamond patterns on the snow outside. Clara found Soaring Hawk already awake, sitting quietly by the window. "Beautiful day for travel," he observed, though without his previous restlessness. "Beautiful day for healing," she countered. "That shoulder still needs attention." As promised, she prepared to change his bandage. This time, Soaring Hawk's discomfort seemed less about the procedure and more about cultural protocols regarding modesty and contact. Among Apache, men and women maintain certain boundaries, he explained as she gathered medical supplies. "Among all peoples," Clara replied, "but healing requires setting some boundaries aside. I'll be as respectful as the work allows." The wound showed encouraging improvement. Infection had receded, edges were beginning to heal cleanly, and range of motion was gradually increasing. As Clara worked, she maintained professional distance while noting how Soaring Hawk's tension gradually eased. "You have healer's hands," he commented once she finished. "In my culture, healers hold positions of respect. Their knowledge must be preserved and shared. I've always believed practical skills should be passed along. That's partially why I live so far from settlement. You learn more when you can't run to others for help." This philosophy seemed to resonate with Apache values about self-reliance and practical knowledge. Soaring Hawk spent the rest of the morning sharing information about medicinal plants native to the area, knowledge Clara recognized could prove invaluable during isolated winters. "This plant grows near your spring," he described carefully, using hands to indicate size and shape. "Leaves reduce fever, root helps with stomach problems. Apache use it for centuries." They discussed preservation methods, proper harvesting times, and preparation techniques. Clara realized she was receiving education that no white doctor or settler could provide, indigenous knowledge developed over generations of careful observation. By midday, their exchange had evolved into something like mutual apprenticeship. Clara taught Soaring Hawk refinements to English vocabulary while learning basic Apache phrases. She showed him her method for maintaining iron tools against rust, while he demonstrated how to keep leather supple in dry conditions. This knowledge, sharing, Soaring Hawk observed during their afternoon meal, creates connection between peoples. Wisdom of one group strengthens another. Your tribal leaders recognize this? Some do. Those are leaders who sent me with a message of cooperation rather than resistance. They understand survival may require learning new ways while maintaining essential traditions. Clara was beginning to grasp the complexity of intertribal politics, rivalries between bands, differing philosophies about resistance versus adaptation, the challenge of maintaining cultural identity while navigating forced changes. The message you carry, would sharing it with a white person violate trust? Soaring Hawk considered carefully. The message concerns tribal unity. Understanding from outsiders may help that unity, but specifics must remain between Apache leaders. His diplomatic response maintained boundaries while acknowledging her interest. Clara appreciated this balance between openness and discretion. That evening brought unexpected visitors again. This time, 3 travelers seeking shelter. Clara recognized 2 men from Fort Apache settlement. William Barnes, a sutler from the ore trading post, and Robert Martinez, who ran a small freight operation. The third was a stranger, a prospector named Jake Turner, heading south to investigate mining claims. The situation required swift thinking. Clara greeted them at the door, stepping outside briefly to speak privately. "I have a guest recovering from illness," she explained. "Traveler caught in the storm. I can offer you shelter in the barn with hot food, but the cabin's too crowded." For more, Barnes, who knew Clara's reputation for hospitality, accepted without question. "Appreciate the kindness, ma'am. Barn shelter's more than we hoped for in these conditions." She quickly organized sleeping arrangements in the barn, provided extra blankets, and promised a meal once they'd settled their horses. Inside, she informed Soaring Hawk of the situation. "3 white men," she explained in a lowered voice. "I've given them a barn shelter, but warned them cabin's too crowded with you recovering here." Soaring Hawk nodded understanding, moving to position himself where he'd be least visible from the cabin entrance. With practiced efficiency, Clara prepared supper portions that would accommodate additional guests while they remained outside. During the meal distribution to the barn, she overheard fragments of conversation that heightened her awareness. Barnes was sharing rumors about increased Apache activity, while Turner expressed opinions about the Indian problem that made Clara's jaw tighten. "Mark my words," Turner declared loudly. "Time's coming when we'll have to settle this issue permanently. Can't have savages roaming free when honest folks are trying to build something." Clara maintained neutral silence while distributing food, but her mind was working rapidly. If these men discovered Soaring Hawk's presence, the consequences could be severe for both of them. When she returned to the cabin, she found Soaring Hawk had moved even further from direct sightlines, positioning himself so that casual glances through windows would miss him entirely. "Your preparedness suggests you've managed similar situations before," she observed quietly. "Being a messenger means becoming invisible when necessary. Your protection allows me to remain hidden rather than flee into a deadly cold." They spent the evening in careful quiet, speaking in whispers when necessary, avoiding activities that might draw attention from the barn. Clara read by lamplight while Soaring Hawk worked on small carvings that made no sound. Around 10, the travelers fell into loud sleep sounds, allowing them to speak normally again. "In the morning, they'll leave early," Clara predicted. "Travelers don't like lingering when they're anxious to reach destinations." "Your judgment about people serves you well," Soaring Hawk commented. "You manage dangerous situation with wisdom. Living alone teaches you to read people quickly. Their intentions usually show in small ways: tone of voice, how they look at your possessions, whether they respect your boundaries." Their whispered conversation continued past usual bedtime, covering topics they hadn't yet explored. Soaring Hawk shared stories of successful cooperation between some settlers and Apache bands, instances where communication and mutual respect had prevented conflicts. "Not all whites see Apache as enemies," he acknowledged. "Some understand that shared land requires shared respect. Not all Apaches see whites as invaders either, from what you've told me," Clara replied. "It's the extremes on both sides that create most problems. Truth, fear, and greed drive many conflicts. Understanding requires seeing past immediate threats to recognize longer perspectives." As they prepared for sleep, Clara realized this conversation marked another threshold crossed. They were no longer simply hostess and guest, or even cultural ambassadors. They had become co-conspirators in maintaining Soaring Hawk's safety while preserving her own position in frontier society. The 5th day began with the expected early departure of the barn guests. Clara provided them with coffee and cornbread for their journey, answering their polite inquiries about her patient with carefully vague responses about recovery progress. After they left, the cabin felt quieter but more companionable than even before their unexpected visitors. Clara and Soaring Hawk moved about their morning routines with increased ease, having navigated external threats successfully together. "Your English improves daily," Clara observed as they discussed plans for the day. "Your Apache words also become clearer," Soaring Hawk responded, with what now qualified as a genuine smile. "You learn quickly for someone who thought my people only spoke in raids and war cries." The gentle teasing indicated how far their relationship had progressed. What had begun as wary medical necessity had evolved into mutual education and now displayed hints of actual friendship. "You're the first Apache I've had the opportunity to know as an individual person rather than a distant threat," Clara admitted. "I'm learning my assumptions were built on stories rather than experience. Many whites never meet Apache except in conflict situations. Understanding requires peaceful interaction, time to see past fear." The morning brought another domestic routine, bread making. As Clara began the familiar process, Soaring Hawk watched with interest until she invited him to participate. "Your shoulder needs gentle exercise. Kneading dough might help mobility." What followed was a surprisingly pleasant hour of shared activity. Soaring Hawk's attempts at dough preparation were awkward but determined, while Clara refined his technique with patient instruction. Their conversation ranged from practical details of frontier cooking to broader philosophical discussions about cultural adaptation. Among Apache, Soaring Hawk shared while working unsuccessfully to achieve smooth dough texture, food preparation carries spiritual significance. Feeding others creates sacred obligations between people. Similar beliefs exist among many cultures, Clara replied, demonstrating proper kneading motion. Breaking bread with someone indicates trust, acceptance. That's probably why shared meals feature in most peacemaking. By midday, they had produced 4 decent loaves, though Soaring Hawk's attempts showed questionable uniformity. As bread baked, filling the cabin with wonderful aromas, Clara recognized they had achieved something remarkable. Normal, peaceful coexistence between representatives of supposedly antagonistic cultures. Their afternoon brought discovery of shared intellectual interests. While Clara had assumed Apache culture was primarily oral, Soaring Hawk revealed surprising familiarity with written English beyond basic communication. "Mission school required reading the Bible," he explained. "But traders also share newspapers sometimes. I read when possible to understand white world beyond territorial boundaries." This admission led Clara to retrieve her small collection of books, carefully preserved volumes that represented significant investment for frontier living. As she presented them, she saw Soaring Hawk's genuine interest, particularly in her atlas showing regional geography. "This book shows all territories," Clara explained, opening to maps of Arizona and surrounding regions. "Help you plan message routes." Soaring Hawk studied the maps with intense concentration, occasionally commenting on inaccuracies based on actual travel experience, but clearly appreciating the overview they provided. "Apache names for many places differ from white names," he shared, pointing to various locations. "But maps help coordinate between those who use either system." They spent hours poring over geographical information, with Soaring Hawk drawing connections between official territorial boundaries and traditional Apache ranges. Clara learned about seasonal patterns that govern tribal movements, water sources that determine possible travel routes, and the significance of various landmarks in Apache culture. This education alone justifies time spent recovering, Clara observed as afternoon light slanted through her windows. "I'm seeing my own land through a completely different perspective." "Knowledge improves with additional viewpoints," Soaring Hawk agreed. He hesitated, then added with careful diplomacy, "Among my people, I am viewed with some suspicion for seeking too much understanding of white ways. Your acceptance helps me believe such understanding serves a valuable purpose." The confidence suggested by his admission moved Clara. She recognized the complexity of his position, navigating between cultures while maintaining credibility with his own people, carrying important tribal communications while developing perspectives some might consider dangerously sympathetic to outsiders. Understanding doesn't require abandoning your own identity, she offered thoughtfully. Perhaps the balance you seek allows both cultures to preserve what's valuable while adapting to necessary changes. Evening fell with them still engaged in geographical discussions, punctuated by broader philosophical exchanges. Clara prepared supper, while Soaring Hawk continued examining her books, particularly a volume of poetry that Thomas had loved. "These words create images in mind," he commented, reading carefully, "like stories my grandmother told, but arranged differently on paper." "Poetry preserves emotion along with information," Clara explained, serving their meal. "Sometimes feelings communicate better than direct statements." They spent their supper conversation comparing Apache oral traditions with written poetry, discovering unexpected similarities in how both cultures used language to preserve important truths and transmit wisdom across generations. As their fifth evening together deepened into companionable quiet, Clara realized something significant had occurred. The crisis that brought Soaring Hawk to her cabin had transformed into opportunity, not just for him to recover physically, but for both of them to discover common ground where none had previously existed. The winter storm that had trapped them together had created unexpected space for building understanding across cultural divisions that usually remained unbridged. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Soaring Hawk's healing allowed increased activity, but also meant eventual departure loomed closer. Whatever happened next, Clara knew this unexpected interlude had permanently altered her perspective on frontier life and the possibilities for cooperation between peoples, too often defined by conflict. The sixth day of Soaring Hawk's recovery dawned with deceptive tranquility. As morning light filtered through frost-etched windows, Clara noticed his restlessness had returned, but now it carried different undertones. Rather than purely medical recovery, it seemed driven by an internal calendar she hadn't yet understood. "The moon changes tonight," he announced while they prepared breakfast. 7 days since the new moon. If the weather holds, I should attempt contact with forward scouts tomorrow. Clara paused in her coffee preparation. Forward scouts. Tribal. Messengers establish contact points during winter travel, pre-arranged locations where information can be exchanged if primary routes become impossible. Soaring Hawk accepted the steaming cup with familiar ease. "The storm has likely delayed. Others also. Tomorrow night, scouts check for signals at designated meeting places." This revelation introduced urgency Clara hadn't anticipated. His mission wasn't simply about carrying messages between distant tribal locations. It involved a coordinated network of information exchange that continued even through harsh winter conditions. "How far are these meeting places?" "Closest is a 3 hours ride in normal conditions, with the current snow, perhaps 5 hours each direction." He tested his wounded shoulder with careful rotation. "But I must try. Others depend on information." Flow continuing, Clara recognized the difficult position this placed them both in. His physical recovery had progressed remarkably, but undertaking a 10-hour round trip through deep snow carried significant risk. Yet denying him the attempt would betray the trust they had built, while potentially compromising tribal communications that might prevent wider conflicts. "You'll need proper winter gear," she decided practically, "and provisions for unexpected delays." Surprise flickered across Soaring Hawk's face. Perhaps he had expected arguments against the journey. "Your support honors the importance of tribal communication." As they crafted plans for his expedition, Clara found herself unexpectedly invested in his success. Over the past week, his mission had transformed from abstract necessity to personal significance. The messages he carried represented more than political information. They contained potential pathways toward peaceful coexistence that might benefit everyone in the territory. "Thomas built a winter coat for hunting trips," she said, retrieving it from the storage chest. "Might fit you better than the blankets you've been wearing." The coat proved surprisingly suitable, its design incorporating practical elements that accommodated Soaring Hawk's build. As he tried it on, Clara noticed how different he appeared from the near-frozen figure she had discovered a week earlier. Recovery had restored not just his physical strength, but his innate presence, the bearing of someone accustomed to carrying responsibility and making difficult decisions. Their morning preparations were interrupted by an unexpected sound. Multiple horses approaching rapidly. Unlike previous visitors who had announced themselves from distance, these riders came at speed, suggesting either urgency or unfriendly intentions. "Hide quickly," Clara instructed, but Soaring Hawk was already moving toward the cabin's back room, gathering his personal items with practiced efficiency. Through her front window, she recognized the lead rider with a sinking heart. Henry Blackwood, a local rancher whose antipathy toward Apache was well known throughout the region. Behind him rode 3 men she didn't immediately recognize, possibly hired hands or associates brought specifically for this visit. Blackwood dismounted without invitation, his heavy boots leaving deep impressions in the trampled snow around. Her cabin door. When Clara opened it, she found him already scanning the area with obvious interest. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began without pleasantries, "we're tracking unusual signs in this area. Apache movement heading north, then tracks leading directly to your homestead." Clara's mind raced, but her expression remained calm. "Many travelers have sought shelter recently, Mr. Blackwood. This storm affected everyone." "We're not interested in regular travelers, Ma'am. We've had reports of a specific Apache moving through, a messenger carrying communications that might threaten settler security." His eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't be harboring such an individual, would you?" The direct accusation carried clear threat. Clara recognized she stood at a crossroads, either confirm his suspicions and face consequences, or lie convincingly enough to protect Soaring Hawk while maintaining some credibility. "I've provided shelter to travelers caught in the storm," she replied carefully. "Same as I would for anyone facing death in this weather. That's basic Christian duty, Mr. Blackwood." "Christian duty doesn't extend to enemies of white settlers," he countered. "These Apache are planning something, coordinating between bands. For possible spring actions against ranches, we have it on good authority from military sources." Clara felt anger rising at his certainty about Apache intentions, but controlled her response. "If you have specific information about threats, shouldn't the Army handle investigation rather than private citizens?" Blackwood's expression darkened. "The Army moves too slow when our families are at risk. Sometimes frontier justice requires immediate action." His companions remained mounted, but Clara noticed them positioning themselves with clear tactical purpose. One moved closer to the barn, another circled toward the cabin's eastern side. This wasn't a casual inquiry. It was a search pattern designed to prevent escape or concealment. "I'm afraid I can't invite you inside," Clara stated firmly. "I'm caring for someone recovering from winter illness. Wouldn't want to risk spreading any contagion to your men." Her fabrication was partially truthful. Visitors did carry risk of illness, but primarily bought time while she calculated options. Inside the cabin, she knew Soaring Hawk would be listening carefully, preparing for whatever developed. "We'll need to check your barn and outbuildings," Blackwood declared rather than requested. "For everyone's safety, you understand." Clara recognized she had limited ability to prevent their search. Denying access would only increase suspicion, while cooperation might demonstrate she had nothing to hide. Assuming Soaring Hawk remained effectively concealed, Of course, she agreed with forced calm, though you'll find only my horses and winter supplies. Would you like coffee for your men while they look? The offer of hospitality served dual purpose, maintaining normal social protocols, while keeping Blackwood occupied with conversation rather than personal investigation. As his men began their search, she led Blackwood toward the barn, deliberately engaging him in discussion about the winter's severity and its impact on local ranching. Inside the barn, his men found exactly what she had indicated: horses, feed, supplies, and the sleeping area where previous night's visitors had sheltered. Their search proved thorough but revealed nothing suspicious. Clara noted with concealed relief that any signs of Soaring Hawk's presence had been effectively obscured by subsequent visitor traffic. Your mention of an invalid inside, Blackwood persisted as they waited for the search to complete. Anyone I might know. Stranger caught in the storm, mostly keeps quiet, fever and weakness from exposure. Clara maintained her story consistently. Should be recovered enough to travel in a few days. Mind if we check on this individual? Men can't be too careful these days. The request felt like a trap. If she refused too strongly, it would increase suspicion. Yet allowing Blackwood inside risked discovery, despite Soaring Hawk's concealment efforts. The man's barely coherent. Mr. Blackwood, and like I mentioned, possible contagion. Your men already have families to return to. Wouldn't want them carrying illness home. Blackwood studied her face intently, clearly weighing his authority against reasonable caution. Before he could respond, one of his men called from the cabin's eastern side. Found tracks here, boss. Looked like they might head toward the canyon ridge. This discovery provided convenient distraction. Blackwood's attention immediately shifted to the potential of tracking the supposed Apache messenger away from Clara's homestead rather than conducting further investigation of her cabin. "Fresh tracks?" he demanded, moving to examine the discovery. "Hard to tell with snow conditions," the man admitted, "but they head northeast, toward tribal gathering areas." Clara recognized these tracks were likely from her own movements between cabin and barn, but their northeast direction aligned conveniently with known Apache territory. If Blackwood chose to follow them, it would draw his search party away while buying precious time. "Might want to pursue while daylight holds," she suggested, with just enough hesitation to sound reluctant, yet cooperative. "Weather changes fast. This time of year." Blackwood made his decision quickly. "We'll follow the trail. If it leads to tribal contact, we need to know." He turned back to Clara with one final warning. "If you're protecting anyone, Mrs. Whitmore, you're placing yourself in serious danger. These Apache won't hesitate to eliminate white witnesses to their activities." "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Blackwood. I'll be sure to report any suspicious activity to proper authorities." The emphasis on proper authorities rather than vigilante groups was subtle but deliberate. Blackwood caught the distinction, his expression hardening briefly before he mounted his horse. "We'll be back through this area soon," he declared. "Make sure your story stays consistent." After they departed, following the tracks that led conveniently away from her cabin, Clara remained outside for several minutes, ensuring their complete withdrawal before returning inside. She found Soaring Hawk had removed himself from concealment, his expression grim with understanding of what had just occurred. "Blackwood," he said simply, "known for organizing settler groups against any Apache interaction. 3 ranches lost, stock to rustlers last winter, blamed all Apache rather than investigating actual thieves. You know of him. Tribal scouts identify such men. Those who choose violence over understanding. His actions threaten peaceful communication between our peoples." Clara sank into her rocking chair, somewhat shaken by how close the confrontation had come to violence. "Your journey tomorrow becomes more dangerous now. Blackwood's group will be actively searching the area. Perhaps we should postpone the journey," Soaring Hawk suggested, though reluctance colored his voice. "Or perhaps we should plan more carefully." Clara's mind was working through possibilities. Blackwood followed tracks northeast. If you take a different route, southwest toward the canyon, then circle back, you might avoid their search pattern entirely. Soaring Hawk considered this proposition carefully. Would you help me evade settlers who consider me a threat to their safety? I've already helped you recover from near death. Why stop at geography? Her answer prompted one of his rare, genuine smiles. Straight-speaking woman indeed. Your practical wisdom matches your courage. They spent the afternoon revising plans for the following day's journey. Using her maps, Clara and Soaring Hawk plotted a route that utilized natural terrain features to avoid likely patrols, while still reaching his designated contact point. Their planning session revealed his extensive knowledge of regional geography, information that had been gathered through generations of tribal travel experience. The canyon route offers concealment, he explained, tracing paths on her map. But winter conditions make footing treacherous. Success depends on taking correct passages through rock formations. Can you identify these passages from landmarks? Yes, but describing them to someone unfamiliar with specific rock shapes proves difficult. Apache navigation relies on direct experience more than mapped abstract. Evening found them preparing equipment for his journey with meticulous care. Clara assembled provisions that would provide maximum nutrition while remaining light enough not to burden his still healing shoulder. Soaring Hawk tested various pieces of gear, ensuring everything met the severe conditions he would face. Take my field glasses, she offered, producing the binoculars she had purchased years earlier for spotting stock. They'll help identify potential threats from a distance. Your generosity continues to surprise. He accepted the instrument carefully. Most whites fear providing Apache with any tools that might be used against settlers. Most whites don't understand that Apache survival skills exceed anything enhanced by simple tools. Your success tomorrow benefits everyone by keeping communication open rather than forcing armed conflict. As darkness fell, they shared what both recognized might be their last dinner together. The meal carried emotional weight beyond its physical. Nourishment represented an end point to the unique situation that had brought them together while acknowledging paths that must diverge tomorrow. When you complete your mission, Clara asked, will you return this way? Perhaps. Tribal movements depend on many factors: weather, resource availability, political developments. He paused thoughtfully. But if circumstances allow, I would honor continuing our friendship. The word friendship hung between them with particular significance. Over the past week, they had navigated across cultural boundaries that usually remained impermeable, discovering shared values and mutual respect. Despite profoundly different backgrounds, your English education suggests you've considered such cross-cultural connections before, Clara observed. Education showed possibilities. Experience with you demonstrates actualities. Soaring Hawk's response carried careful weight. Among my people, there are questions about messengers who develop too much sympathy for other cultures. Balance remains essential. This admission revealed additional complexity to his position. Not only did he face external threats from settlers like Blackwood, but internal pressures from Apache, who might view his growing understanding of white perspectives as a dangerous compromise. Every bridge builder faces suspicion from both sides, Clara offered, but someone must maintain connections if either culture benefits from avoiding constant conflict. Your husband, did he face such challenges attempting fairness in dealings? Thomas often stood between extremes. Some settlers accused him of being too soft on Apache, while some Apache initially distrusted his intentions. But consistency proved his character over time. Soaring Hawk nodded appreciatively. Time tests all alliances. Tomorrow's journey represents an attempt to preserve tribal cohesion while information sharing continues. Success may help convince both our peoples that understanding serves survival better than endless conflict. As they prepared sleeping arrangements for potentially their last night as housemates, Clara found herself reflecting on the week's unexpected developments. Soaring Hawk's arrival had interrupted her solitary winter routine, but introduced perspectives and possibilities she hadn't imagined. "The bread we baked," she remembered suddenly. "Take extra loaves for your return journey. They'll keep well in cold conditions." "Your practical thinking extends to all situations," he replied, carefully packing the offered provisions. "Such preparation serves messengers well. We never know when the next meals will come." Their conversation continued past usual bedtime, covering topics they hadn't yet explored. Soaring Hawk shared details about Apache family structures and educational traditions, while Clara explained aspects of frontier settlement development and the complex motivations that brought various white populations westward. "Many settlers come seeking opportunity," she explained, "but some flee problems in eastern cities or failures in other endeavors. Knowing someone's reasons for heading west often predicts their behavior once they arrive." "Similar patterns exist among Apache," Soaring Hawk noted. "Some join tribal movements seeking tradition, others avoiding consequences of individual actions. Community strength depends on balancing different motivations toward common goals." Around midnight, they finally established their sleeping arrangements. Clara noticed that Soaring Hawk positioned his blankets closer to the door than previous. "And nights, prepared for quick departure if necessary. Your departure tomorrow places us both at risk," she acknowledged before settling into bed. "Your courage in continuing association despite risks demonstrates rare character," he replied. "Whatever happens after tomorrow, you have earned respect among Apache who value both wisdom and bravery." As Clara drifted toward sleep, she considered how dramatically her understanding of frontier life had expanded through this unexpected encounter. The isolated safety of her homestead had been disrupted by external conflicts she had previously viewed only from distance. Now she found herself actively participating in events that might influence broader relationships between cultures. Tomorrow would bring Soaring Hawk's departure on his crucial mission, leaving her alone again, but irrevocably changed by their week together. The knowledge they had shared, the trust they had built, and the perspectives they had each gained could not be erased by mere physical separation. Outside, wind began rising again, suggesting weather changes might complicate tomorrow's journey. But inside the cabin, quiet resolve had replaced earlier uncertainties. Both had discovered that understanding between supposed enemies was not just possible, but perhaps necessary for navigating the changing landscape of Arizona territory. The seventh day's dawn would mark the transition from extraordinary circumstances to whatever new normal would emerge. As sleep claimed them both, the certainty remained that neither would face the future unchanged by their week of shared survival and growing respect across cultural boundaries that had seemed unbridgeable. Just days before, morning arrived too soon, with the sound of increasing wind and the metallic scent of coming snow carried through cabin chinks. Clara woke to find Soaring Hawk already dressed, checking equipment with methodical precision. "Weather turns again," he announced quietly. "I must leave early to complete the journey before storm arrives." She quickly prepared breakfast, more substantial than usual, to provide energy for his journey. As they ate, the approaching weather system made itself increasingly evident through dropping temperature and strengthening wind gusts. "Perhaps you should delay another day," Clara suggested, though she knew his answer before speaking. "Other messengers wait at contact points. They'll leave tomorrow if no one appears." Spring coordination requires these connections. His determination was absolute, born from responsibilities that transcended personal comfort or safety. Clara understood this unwavering commitment to duty, having seen similar dedication in her late husband's work ethic. "Then we should finalize our preparations." The weather window grows smaller. Together they assembled his travois with extra care. Clara provided additional emergency supplies, emergency fire-starting materials wrapped in oilcloth, dried meat prepared with extra salt for preservation, and a small pouch of precious coffee beans for energy during difficult moments. "If you encounter any of Blackwood's men," she counseled, "remember they're watching for specific signs. Move like a trapper or surveyor checking trap lines, someone with legitimate business in winter territory." "Your strategic thinking serves me well," Soaring Hawk acknowledged, securing the borrowed coat that might help disguise his identity from a distance. "May these precautions prove unnecessary, but preparation prevents panic." As he completed final checks, Clara found herself struggling with unexpected emotion. This departure, though anticipated since his arrival, marked the end of a unique interlude that had enriched her isolated existence while challenging numerous assumptions about cross-cultural contact. "Soaring Hawk," she began, then paused, uncertain how to express thoughts that violated conventional boundaries. "This week has changed my understanding of many things. I hope circumstances allow our paths to cross again." He turned from his equipment, preparations, meeting her gaze directly. Among Apache, there is custom of recognizing profound connections forged through shared hardship. You risked position in your community to preserve my life, then shared knowledge and shelter freely. This creates a bond that transcends simple gratitude. The formal acknowledgement carried emotional weight that moved Clara deeply. "Whatever happens, with territorial politics or cultural conflicts, remember that individual understanding between peoples remains possible. You've proven that to me. And you have proven that wisdom and courage exist among all peoples, waiting only for circumstances that allow their expression." As he prepared to depart, the approaching storm made itself felt through sudden temperature drops and the first flakes of new snow beginning to fall. Time constraints demanded immediate action despite the emotional significance of parting. "Travel safely," Clara said simply. "Trust your knowledge and instincts. Remain alert but not fearful," he counseled in return. "Changes come to frontier life whether we invite them or not. Your actions this week demonstrate capacity for navigating whatever arrives." With a final nod of mutual respect, Soaring Hawk guided his horse through Clara's gate and headed toward the canyon route they had planned. Clara watched until trees obscured his figure, then returned inside to face her cabin alone, but not quite as alone as before his arrival. The quiet that filled her home carried a different quality now. 7 days of shared conversation, mutual education, and growing respect had altered the space permanently. Though external circumstances required their separation, the connection forged across cultural boundaries would influence how Clara viewed both her isolation and her role in the broader territorial conflicts that shaped frontier life. As snow began falling with increasing intensity, she understood that Soaring Hawk's mission carried implications far beyond tribal communications. His success might contribute to maintaining tenuous peace during a time when extremes on both sides pushed toward armed conflict. Clara turned to her daily chores with renewed perspective. The chickens still needed care, the fire required feeding, and winter preparations continued regardless of political complications. But now these routine tasks carried additional significance, maintaining stability in an environment increasingly shaped by forces beyond individual control. The storm that had brought Soaring Hawk to her door was about to arrive again, though in different form. As wind howled with mounting intensity and snow began accumulating on windowsills, Clara recognized that her brief interlude as cultural intermediary had prepared her for whatever challenges lay ahead. Tomorrow would reveal whether Soaring Hawk's mission succeeded, whether Blackwood's search party discovered anything threatening, and whether the approaching storm would provide cover for tribal communications or create additional hardships for all frontier inhabitants. But tonight, as she settled beside her fire with a simple dinner and the books they had shared, Clara felt profound gratitude for the unexpected education she had received. Understanding had replaced fear, knowledge had overcome prejudice, and friendship had emerged from circumstances that should have produced only conflict. The cabin's warmth wrapped around her like protection against both physical cold and cultural uncertainties. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with wisdom earned through 7 transformative days with an Apache messenger who had shown her that bridges between worlds could be built by those brave enough to attempt the construction. The silence in Clara's cabin felt oppressive after Soaring Hawk's departure. Each creak of settling wood, each pop from the dying fire, seemed magnified in the absence of his quiet presence. Clara found herself checking the window repeatedly, watching for any sign of his return or movement along the distant canyon trail. By late afternoon, the storm had intensified beyond her predictions. Snow fell in thick horizontal sheets, and visibility decreased to mere yards. Whatever tracks Soaring Hawk had left would be completely obscured within hours, a blessing if Blackwood's men attempted pursuit, but a curse if Soaring Hawk himself needed to find his way back unexpectedly. As dusk approached, Clara heard the now familiar sound of approaching horses. Her heart sank as she recognized the rhythmic pattern of multiple riders moving in formation, likely military patrol. Through her frosted window, she could make out 4 cavalry soldiers, their blue coats nearly invisible against the darkening sky and swirling snow. When the knock came, it carried authority that civilian visits lacked. Clara opened the door to find Lieutenant Patrick Hayes, whom she recognized from occasional supply runs to Fort Apache. "Mrs. Whitmore," Hayes began formally, removing his hat despite the bitter cold. "Apologies for the late hour. We're investigating reports of unauthorized Apache movement through this sector. Come in, Lieutenant. This weather isn't fit for extended conversation outside." As Hayes entered, followed by a sergeant who remained near the door, Clara noticed the immediate professional assessment that swept her cabin. Military training created systematic observers, and her small space would reveal much to experienced eyes. "We've had reports," Hayes continued once inside, "of a specific Apache individual moving through private land without coordination with federal authorities. Someone matching this description was allegedly seen seeking shelter in this vicinity." Clara's mind raced. Unlike Blackwood's civilian search, military investigation carried legal authority and potential criminal consequences. Her responses would need careful calibration between truthfulness and self-preservation. "Many travelers have sought shelter during recent storms, Lieutenant. The weather has been exceptionally severe this winter." "Indeed. However, this individual is believed to be carrying communications that could affect territorial stability." Hayes produced a folded paper. "Tribal messages coordinating movements that concern both settler security and government relations." The sergeant moved slightly, positioning himself where he could observe both the cabin's interior and any potential exit points. Clara recognized the tactical formation. They expected possible deception and were prepared for resistance. "Communications between tribal leaders," Clara responded carefully, "have occurred for generations. Unless you have evidence of specific threats to settlers, such messenger activity falls within established treaty protocols." Hayes blinked slightly at her knowledgeable response. Most frontier civilians deferred to military assessment of tribal relations without question. Her accurate reference to treaty provisions suggested broader understanding than expected from an isolated rancher's widow. "Mrs. Whitmore, your familiarity with tribal protocols is unusual for your position. My late husband dealt with various peoples honestly and fairly. I maintained his approach. Knowledge prevents misunderstandings that lead to unnecessary conflicts. Commendable philosophy, Hayes acknowledged, though his tone remained professional rather than friendly. However, current territorial tensions require us to investigate any tribal communications that might affect federal authority. Clara recognized she was being tested. Military protocol demanded Hayes pursue his investigation thoroughly, yet he seemed personally uncomfortable with the implications of interrogating an isolated widow during a severe storm. "You're welcome to search the property," she offered, hoping the invitation would appear cooperative rather than strategic. With Soaring Hawk gone, she had nothing to hide, and voluntary cooperation might satisfy Hayes more effectively than continued questioning. "That's gracious of you, ma'am." "Sergeant Morrison?" The sergeant nodded and stepped outside, likely to signal other personnel to conduct systematic property inspection. While they waited, Hayes continued his questioning with a carefully structured inquiry. "The individual we're seeking was wounded, possibly a shoulder injury. Have you treated anyone matching such a description?" The specific detail caught Clara off guard. How had military intelligence tracked Soaring Hawk's condition so precisely? Someone had provided remarkably detailed information about his movements and medical state. "Anyone who arrives injured in winter storm conditions needs immediate medical attention," she replied carefully. "Basic frontier humanity demands such assistance regardless of background." Agreed. Yet harboring specific individuals wanted for questioning represents different circumstances than simple medical emergency response. His careful phrasing indicated Hayes operated within complex institutional pressures. Personal values might support humanitarian assistance, but military duty required investigating potential threats to government authority. "Lieutenant Hayes," Clara said directly, "I believe in treating winter emergencies as medical rather than political issues. If someone collapsed outside your door during this storm, wouldn't you provide shelter until they could travel safely?" "Personal inclinations often conflict with official responsibilities, Mrs. Whitmore. The question becomes balancing individual conscience against broader community security." Through this exchange, Clara gained unexpected insight into Hayes's character. Unlike Blackwood's aggressive certainty or the typical frontier xenophobia, Hayes demonstrated nuanced understanding of complex tribal situations while remaining constrained by military obligations. The sergeant returned, accompanied by another soldier. "Property cleared, Lieutenant. No signs of current occupation except Mrs. Whitmore's usual livestock and supplies." Hayes nodded acknowledgement, then turned back to Clara. "We're also tracking multiple civilian groups conducting independent searches. Mr. Blackwood specifically mentioned visiting this residence earlier today. This admission revealed that military and civilian activities were intersecting dangerously. If Hayes knew about Blackwood's unauthorized search, the situation had escalated beyond mere territorial dispute into conflicting jurisdictional authorities. "Mr. Blackwood's group did pass through," Clara confirmed. "They seemed intent on pursuing tracks heading northeast. I reminded them that proper investigative authority rests with military and federal agencies." "Wise counsel," Hayes approved. "Unfortunately, civilian groups often exceed legal boundaries when tensions rise. Their actions sometimes create more problems than they solve." A moment of genuine connection passed between them. Both understood that frontier justice operated beyond official structures, creating situations where competing authorities could collide dangerously. "Our orders," Hayes continued, "require monitoring all tribal communications that might affect spring territorial movements. However, we also have responsibility to prevent civilian vigilante actions that could escalate into broader conflicts." Clara Recognized the delicate political balancing Hayes navigated. Military authority needed to maintain control without triggering unnecessary confrontations, while also preventing civilian extremists from precipitating violence through independent action. If tribal messengers communicate through established networks to prevent conflicts, she ventured, wouldn't supporting such communication serve everyone's interest? Hayes regarded her thoughtfully. An interesting perspective. Not everyone shares such nuanced understanding of tribal politics. Living out here requires understanding different viewpoints for survival. Simple categories of friend versus enemy don't match complex frontier realities. As their conversation deepened, Clara sensed Hayes appreciating her informed perspective. Few frontier residents engaged with institutional complexities beyond immediate survival concerns. "We're particularly concerned," Hayes admitted confidentially, "about information suggesting coordinated spring movements by multiple Apache bands. If accurate, such coordination could either facilitate peaceful negotiation or organize resistance against federal policies." This intelligence revelation provided context for why military and civilian searches had intensified. Spring thaw would enable large-scale movement, and both sides seemed prepared for either negotiation or conflict. "Lieutenant, in your experience, do Apache typically coordinate for warfare or for ensuring survival when facing forced relocation?" Hayes considered her question seriously. "Both, unfortunately. Traditional communication networks serve many purposes. Current challenge involves distinguishing peaceful coordination from potential military organization." Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by commotion outside. Through the window, Clara could see multiple riders converging on her property. Not additional military personnel, but civilian forces that included the unmistakable profile of Henry Blackwood. Hayes moved immediately to the door. "Remain inside, Mrs. Whitmore. This situation requires official management." The lieutenant stepped outside into the worsening storm, where Clara could hear raised voices but not distinguish specific words. The confrontation between military and civilian search groups represented exactly the jurisdictional conflict both Soaring Hawk and Hayes had feared. After several tense minutes, Hayes returned, his expression grim. "I've ordered all civilian searchers to withdraw immediately. Mr. Blackwood objected strenuously, but will comply to avoid arrest for interfering with military operations." This tension between different authorities, Clara observed, could escalate into violence regardless of Apache actions. "Precisely our concern. Uncoordinated responses create chaos that serves no one's interests except those who profit from conflict." As Hayes prepared to depart, he paused with additional instruction. "Mrs. Whitmore, if the individual we discussed does return to this area, please notify military authorities immediately rather than attempting independent action. Your safety depends on maintaining proper protocols." "And if civilian groups return first?" Hayes's jaw tightened. "Lock your cabin and use emergency signals if necessary. We'll maintain increased patrols through this sector." After the military contingent departed, Clara barred her door and stoked the fire vigorously. The cabin felt simultaneously more secure, with Hayes's promise of protection, and more endangered by the multiple factions now actively searching her vicinity. Evening deepened into night, with the storm continuing unabated. Clara attempted routine activities, mending, reading, preparing. Simple dinner, but found concentration impossible. Her mind kept returning to Soaring Hawk's journey and whether he had successfully reached his contact point before weather worsened. Around midnight, a soft sound outside brought her instantly alert. Not the multiple horses of search parties, but something subtle near her woodpile. Clara approached the window carefully, rifle in hand, trying to discern movement through blowing snow. A figure emerged from the storm, not heading toward her cabin but moving along its eastern side toward the barn. Clara caught her breath. The size and movement pattern suggested someone she recognized. Quickly wrapping herself in outer garments, she ventured into the storm. Behind the cabin, partially sheltered by the woodpile, she found Soaring Hawk attempting to care for his horse, an animal clearly exhausted from extended travel. "You returned through this weather?" she called quietly, helping lead the horse. Toward the barn. Contact successful, but Blackwood's men established watching positions along main routes back, had to circle far south, then approach through the canyon during a storm. His voice carried both exhaustion and satisfaction. Journey accomplished, though barely. In the barn's relative warmth, Clara could assess his condition. Fatigue had replaced the recovering strength she'd noticed that morning, and his wounded shoulder showed signs of strain from the demanding ride. "Did your messages reach their destination?" "Successfully exchanged. Other messengers confirmed tribal consensus for spring gathering. Peaceful settlement exploration remains the primary goal, though defensive preparations continue as necessary." Precaution. Clara processed this intelligence. The information Hayes sought had been confirmed. Apache were indeed coordinating movements. But Soaring Hawk's details suggested preparation for negotiation rather than warfare. "Multiple groups searched for you today, military and civilian. The situation has intensified beyond anything I anticipated." Expected. Winter messages always draw attention as spring approaches. Those who fear change multiply surveillance. When seasons shift, promise new possibilities. As they removed his saddle and attended to his horse, Clara detailed the day's events. Blackwood's return with more men, Lieutenant Hayes's official investigation, and the near confrontation between civilian and military authorities. "Your responses demonstrated wisdom." Soaring Hawk commended her handling of official questioning. "Both groups now recognize this location as politically neutral rather than strategically partisan. Nevertheless, your return creates new dangers. Both factions will increase monitoring, and neither approves continued association between us." Soaring Hawk acknowledged this reality with a grave nod. "Original mission concluded successfully. Remaining here now endangers you unnecessarily while providing minimal benefit to tribal interests." "Where will you go?" "North toward tribal winter camps. Weather provides concealment for several days of movement. By the time snow clears, I'll be beyond my immediate pursuit range." Clara felt conflicted emotions, relief that he would continue. Beyond dangerous surveillance zones, disappointment that their unexpected friendship would end permanently. "Rest tonight. Your horse needs recovery, and morning light will help identify the safest departure route." They returned to the cabin where Clara quickly prepared substantial food, while Soaring Hawk warmed himself by the fire. Physical signs of his extended journey were evident. Fatigue lines around his eyes, slight tremor in hands from cold exposure, protective positioning of his healing shoulder. "Your mission's success must feel significant," she observed while serving the hastily prepared meal. "Success measured in conflicts prevented rather than battles won. Messages exchanged today may preserve many lives during difficult transitions ahead." They ate in companionable silence, both recognizing that extensive conversation would require energy better conserved for his continued journey. Yet Clara felt compelled to address concerns that had occupied her thoughts during his absence. "The information you carry about tribal coordination, Lieutenant Hayes specifically sought such intelligence. How do you maintain necessary secrecy while ensuring communication serves peaceful purposes?" Soaring Hawk considered carefully before answering. "Transparency serves different functions at different times. Complete openness invites premature military response, while complete secrecy breeds fear that escalates into preemptive action. Skilled messengers share enough truth to prevent misunderstanding, while withholding specifics that might be misinterpreted or misused." His diplomatic explanation revealed sophisticated understanding of political communication, knowledge that belied simple stereotypes about tribal societies. Your education extends beyond mission school and casual settler interaction, Clara observed. How many messengers possess such a comprehensive perspective? Each band develops leaders capable of navigating complex political situations. My particular background prepared me for this role, but others carry equally important skills, negotiation abilities, territorial knowledge, spiritual guidance. Tribal survival depends on maintaining diverse expertise. As they settled for what would likely be their final evening together, Clara reflected on how profoundly her recent experiences had altered her understanding of frontier complexities. Soaring Hawk represented not simply cultural difference, but sophisticated political navigation that rivaled any diplomat's capabilities. Tomorrow marks another transition, she acknowledged as they prepared sleeping arrangements. Your departure returns us both to our separate worlds, but with altered perspectives that can't be erased. True connections transcend physical separation, Soaring Hawk replied, settling into his familiar position near the fire. Knowledge shared between individuals continues influencing actions long after direct contact ends. The storm outside intensified, rattling windows and testing the cabin's construction. Inside, warmth and quiet companionship created contrast with both external conditions and the political tensions that would resume tomorrow. Clara found herself memorizing details she might forget, the steady rhythm of Soaring Hawk's breathing, the particular way firelight reflected from his carved wooden items, the mixture of cedar and something indefinably wild that accompanied his presence. Your courage in harboring me despite obvious risks, Soaring Hawk said from his blankets, created possibility where none existed. Such actions shape history more profoundly than dramatic conflicts. Individual choices matter, Clara agreed softly, even when, especially when, they contradict prevailing fears and prejudices. Sleep claimed them both with the knowledge that morning would bring final separation. Outside, the storm continued, its relentless assault, while inside two people from different worlds shared their last night of unexpected friendship before returning to the complex realities that frontier life demanded from all its inhabitants. Dawn arrived without fanfare, the storm having exhausted itself during the night. Through her frosted windows, Clara observed a transformed landscape, pristine white, broken only by the dark shapes of trees and outbuildings. The silence felt profound after 2 days of howling wind. Soaring Hawk was already awake when she rose, his belongings organized with the methodical efficiency that characterized his every action. The finality of his preparations struck Clara with unexpected force. This departure would be definitive, unlike his planned journey to the contact point. Circumstances demanded he continue beyond the reach of both military and civilian pursuit. Weather. It cleared perfectly for travel, he observed, accepting the coffee she offered. Fresh snow covers all tracks. I can move north without leaving a trail for followers. Clara nodded, understanding the tactical advantage. Yet the practical benefits couldn't diminish her sense of loss. Over 9 days, her isolated cabin had become a bridge between worlds, a concept she hadn't imagined possible before the storm brought an unconscious Apache to her doorstep. I've prepared additional provisions, she said, indicating the pack she'd assembled. Food for several days, medicines for your shoulder, and coffee for energy when nights grow long. Soaring Hawk examined her gift with the careful attention he gave to all practical matters. Your continued generosity confirms the wisdom of tribal elders. True character reveals itself through actions towards strangers, not only family. As they shared breakfast for the final time, Clara found herself wanting to extend this moment. Simple routines they'd established over days of forced proximity had created patterns she hadn't realized she valued until faced with their permanent conclusion. "Will your people question your extended absence?" she asked, genuinely curious about how tribal structures managed messenger duties during winter months. The scheduled contact points allow flexibility for weather delays. What cannot be scheduled is explaining relationships formed during emergencies. He met her gaze directly. "Some tribal members may view our association with suspicion. Messenger, becoming too familiar with white perspectives, and some whites would view my assistance as treason to my race," Clara acknowledged. "Fear drives both sides toward isolation rather than understanding." Their conversation was interrupted by hoofbeats approaching from the east, a single rider moving cautiously. Clara recognized the pattern. Someone scouting rather than attacking, probably checking whether yesterday's searches had been successful. "Back to the concealment routine," she said wryly, noting how quickly Soaring Hawk moved to position himself out of sight from the windows. The visitor proved to be Marcus Fletcher, a young settler she knew primarily through occasional encounters at Fort Apache. Unlike yesterday's military or vigilante searches, Fletcher's approach suggested social call rather than investigation. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he called after dismounting. "Thought I'd check how you fared through the storm. Rough weather for anyone isolated." Clara opened the door partially, maintaining her now practiced stance of polite caution. "Appreciate the concern, Marcus. Storm was severe, but the cabin held up well." "That's good. We heard the military was through here yesterday. Some trouble about Apache movement in the area?" Lieutenant Hayes asked routine questions about travelers seeking shelter. Nothing specific. She deliberately downplayed yesterday's tensions. "Gave him coffee," answered honestly, and he continued with his duties. Fletcher nodded, though his expression suggested he'd hoped for more detailed information. "Blackwood's been organizing additional patrols. Says the army ain't doing enough about Indian troubles." "Mr. Blackwood seems inclined toward precipitous action," Clara responded carefully. "Military authority exists for handling such matters through proper channels." "Maybe so," Fletcher shrugged. "But some folks are tired of waiting for official solutions. Winter's ending soon. If Apache are planning something—" "Marcus," Clara interrupted gently but firmly, "fear of what might happen often creates more problems than addressing actual threats. Has anyone specific wronged you personally?" The question caught him off guard. "Well, no, but stories circulate. Last winter's raids in Texas, cattle losses near Silver Creek. Stories multiply during idle winter months. Come spring, facts usually prove less dramatic than rumors." Fletcher considered this, perhaps recognizing truth in her observation. "You're probably right, ma'am. Just folks get anxious when change approaches." After he departed, apparently satisfied that nothing dramatic had occurred at her homestead, Clara returned inside to find Soaring Hawk studying her maps while finishing his coffee. "Your visitor carried questions, not accusations," he noted. "Such curiosity precedes broader community tensions. People fear what they don't understand. Your presence here, if known, would confirm everyone's worst assumptions about Indian troubles, while also disproving those assumptions through our peaceful interaction." Soaring Hawk refolded the map carefully. "Contradiction requires more complex thinking than most prefer during uncertain times." As morning light strengthened, casting sharp shadows across the snow-covered landscape, they completed final preparations for his departure. Clara helped him load his horse, ensuring weight distribution wouldn't strain his healing shoulder. "Travel southwest for the first hour," she counseled, sharing her understanding of local geography. "Canyon provides concealment before you turn north toward tribal lands. Avoid the eastern ridge. That's where civilian patrols concentrate." Soaring Hawk nodded appreciation for her strategic advice. "Your knowledge of these lands serves escapees and helpers equally. Thomas chose a remarkable woman for his wife." The compliment, delivered with Apache directness, touched Clara deeply. Throughout their association, Soaring Hawk had maintained respectful formality that occasionally yielded to genuine friendship. This acknowledgement felt like a farewell between equals rather than a simple guest thanking the hostess. "Before you leave," Clara said hesitantly, retrieving something from her dresser, "I want you to have this." She presented a small brass compass. Thomas carried it throughout his army service, then used it for surveying our land. While you know territory better than any instrument could indicate, sometimes tools prove useful during disorientation. Soaring Hawk accepted the compass with visible emotion, perhaps the first time she'd witnessed him genuinely surprised by an unexpected gift. "This carries history and trust," he said quietly, turning the instrument to watch its needle settle. "Among my people, such gifts create bonds that extend beyond individual lives. Your husband's tool now helps preserve tribal communications he never knew existed. Objects carry forward the intentions of those who owned them." Thomas believed in fair dealing and preventing conflicts through understanding. "This compass continues." And that purpose. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both recognizing the symbolic weight of this exchange. Clara had given more than a practical tool. She had entrusted Soaring Hawk with a personal artifact that represented her late husband's values. Values she had chosen to apply toward someone her community would consider an enemy. "I must leave before full daylight reveals my movements," Soaring Hawk announced, though reluctance tinged his voice. "But first, please accept something in return." From his medicine pouch, he withdrew a small carved stone, intricate designs creating patterns that seemed to shift subtly in the light. "This represents wind and water," he explained, "created by tribal artist who believes elemental forces shape all relationships. Wind brings change, water adapts yet persists. Together, they carve landscapes gradually but permanently." Clara accepted the stone, feeling its unexpected weight and smooth texture. "I'll treasure this and the philosophy it represents." "When spring arrives," Soaring Hawk continued, "and tensions increase as territorial changes accelerate, remember that gradual understanding carves deeper impressions than dramatic conflicts." He mounted his horse, adjusting his position to minimize shoulder strain. Morning light caught the brass buttons of the borrowed coat, creating momentary flashes that seemed oddly celebratory despite the seriousness of departure. "Clara Whitmore," he said formally, using her full name for the first time, "you have honored traditions of hospitality beyond cultural boundaries. This action will be remembered in tribal histories, even if known only to few. Safe travels. Soaring Hawk, may your messages continue building understanding rather than reinforcing divisions." With a final nod, he guided his horse toward the southwest canyon route they had discussed. Clara watched until trees obscured his departure, then stood another moment absorbing the significance of this conclusion. Returning to her cabin, she was struck by how empty it felt, despite containing all her familiar possessions. 9 days had sufficiently altered her perspective that solitude now carried different quality, not the comfortable isolation she had cultivated since Thomas's death, but awareness of connections beyond her small world. The morning passed in necessary tasks, cleaning up from Soaring Hawk's presence, reorganizing supplies, tending to livestock. Yet Clara found herself pausing frequently to examine the carved stone he had given her, its designs revealing new patterns each time she viewed it from different angles. Around noon, activity at her eastern boundary drew her attention. Treaty riders approached. Not the aggressive searching of previous days, but steady, purposeful movement suggesting official business. She recognized Captain William Morrison from Fort Apache headquarters, accompanied by 2 enlisted men. Morrison dismounted, with military precision, removing his hat as she opened the door. "Mrs. Whitmore, good day." I apologize for the intrusion, but we're conducting a follow-up investigation regarding recent Apache messenger activity in this sector. Unlike Lieutenant Hayes's more exploratory questioning, Morrison's tone carried definitive authority that suggested specific knowledge rather than general inquiry. Lieutenant Hayes submitted his report yesterday. I wasn't aware that additional investigation was necessary. Circumstances have evolved, Morrison replied diplomatically. Tribal scouts confirmed that critical communications occurred during the storm period. We need to ensure all civilian contacts were appropriately handled. Clara interpreted this. Bureaucratic language. Someone had provided military intelligence with more specific information about Soaring Hawk's successful mission. Her response would require careful calibration between cooperation and self-preservation. I've assisted various travelers during the recent severe weather, Captain. Basic humanitarian aid during life-threatening conditions. Commendable. However, we've received intelligence suggesting a particular Apache individual completed message delivery, despite our attempts to monitor such activities. Morrison's expression remained professionally neutral. Your homestead's location made it a likely waypoint for such travel. Clara realized she stood at a crucial decision point. Military authority could compel her to reveal details about Soaring Hawk's presence, yet complete transparency might endanger both herself and any hope for continued peaceful communication between cultures. Captain Morrison, if tribal messengers traveled through area during the storm, they did so seeking survival rather than creating military threats. I provided shelter to any traveler facing death in winter conditions, regardless of background. Understandable position, Morrison acknowledged. However, current territorial tensions require us to verify that no unauthorized tribal communications occurred through civilian properties. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Morrison employing increasingly specific questions designed to elicit details about Soaring Hawk's presence, while Clara maintained careful honesty, without volunteering information that would compromise either party. Finally, Morrison seemed to reach a conclusion. Mrs. Whitmore, your record of fair dealing with all frontier populations is well established. I'll note in my report that you acted within established humanitarian protocols during extreme weather conditions. After the military departed, Clara recognized that her actions had probably reached their examination limit. Official documentation now existed acknowledging her assistance to travelers during the storm without specifying unauthorized tribal communications. That afternoon, she made a decision that surprised herself with its audacity. Using her small store of paper and ink, Clara began writing a letter to Captain Morrison, not defending her actions or providing additional information, but proposing a perspective that might influence broader military policy. In careful, measured language, she described observations about effective cross-cultural communication developed through years of frontier living. She explained how humanitarian assistance during emergencies created foundations for peaceful coexistence more effectively than military surveillance or civilian vigilante actions. The letter concluded with diplomatic suggestions. Perhaps military strategy might benefit from recognizing that individual acts of assistance during crisis build trust more effectively than widespread monitoring. Those who experience fair treatment become advocates for peaceful resolution rather than resistant forces requiring suppression. She sealed the letter carefully, understanding it represented an unprecedented presumption for an isolated widow to offer policy recommendations to military command. Yet her recent experiences had convinced her that silence amounted to complicity, with escalating tensions that served no one's interests. That evening, as temperatures dropped toward what would likely be the winter's final severe cold snap, Clara reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events that had transformed her quiet winter into a pivotal experience in cross-cultural understanding. The carved stone soaring hawk had caught lamplight from her table, its patterns seeming to flow like water while remaining constant like stone. Wind and water, forces of change and persistence combined, indeed described what had occurred between them. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ride to Fort Apache and personally deliver her. Letter to Captain Morrison. The action carried risks, but so had every choice since she had discovered a dying Apache outside her door. At some point, standing still became more dangerous than moving forward, as she banked her fire for the night and prepared for solitary sleep once again. Clara understood that her winter had permanently altered. Two worlds had touched through the most unlikely circumstances, creating ripples that would extend far beyond her small cabin in ways neither she nor Soaring Hawk could predict. Outside, the night air carried unusual warmth, suggesting winter's grip was finally loosening. Spring approached with its promise of movement, change, and the consequences of choices made during long, dark months of isolation. Whatever those consequences might bring, Clara faced them with newfound confidence in her capacity to act according to principle rather than fear. The quiet that settled over her cabin carried a different quality now. Not empty isolation, but peaceful reflection after profound change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she rested with the satisfaction of having chosen understanding over suspicion, humanity over convention, and bridge building over barrier maintaining. These were choices, she believed, that neither Thomas nor Soaring Hawk would question, regardless of their different cultural perspectives. As sleep approached, Clara's last conscious thought was gratitude for the storm that had forced such unexpected education upon her. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important lessons arrived disguised as emergencies, requiring immediate action before prudence could intervene. Such had been her winter's greatest gift, the discovery that individual courage could create understanding, where institutional structures had built only division. 6 weeks had passed since Soaring Hawk's departure. March arrived, with temperatures that finally held warmth throughout daylight hours, and the omnipresent snow had retreated to shaded hollows and north-facing slopes. Clara had made her journey to Fort Apache, delivered her letter to a surprised but respectful Captain Morrison, and returned to find spring asserting itself across her land. Daily patterns had settled into familiar routine, though altered by experiences that couldn't be erased. She'd received no response to her letter, nor had she expected one. Military bureaucracies operated on their own timelines, and a policy recommendation from a widow rancher hardly constituted priority correspondence. This particular morning found Clara working in her garden, preparing soil for early planting. The physical labor provided welcome distraction from the isolation that felt more pronounced after her weeks of companionship with Soaring Hawk. She had cultivated solitude for years after Thomas's death, but their brief friendship had awakened appreciation for meaningful conversation that her neighbors rarely provided. Around midday, a rhythmic sound caught her attention. Not quite drumming, but distinct percussion carrying across the warming air. Clara paused in her work, listening carefully. Sound traveled far in the thin mountain air, but this seemed closer than distant tribal activities typically accounted for. The percussion continued, gradually becoming distinguishable as multiple sources rather than a single drummer. Curious and slightly wary, Clara moved toward her cabin for the field glasses Soaring Hawk had returned before his departure. From her elevated position near the garden, she could scan the approaches to her homestead. What she observed through the lenses made her lower the glasses in disbelief, then raise them again for confirmation. Coming across the southern ridge, Descending in orderly formation was a large group of Apache riders, not a war party, but something more ceremonial in appearance. Bright colors caught the afternoon sun, and the lead riders carried what appeared to be decorated lances or poles that glinted with metal and feathers. Clara's heart raced as she counted the approaching figures. More than 60 riders, with additional figures on foot or driving horses packed with gear. This was no small scouting party or accidental intrusion. This was a deliberate embassy moving directly toward her isolated homestead. She quickly secured her animals and retreated to her cabin, unsure whether to prepare for defense or welcome. The approaching group showed no signs of hostility. Their movement was steady but unhurried, formal rather than aggressive. Yet the sheer numbers involved made this unprecedented in her frontier experience. As the procession drew nearer, Clara could distinguish more details. Children rode with some warriors. Women managed pack animals loaded with what appeared to be supplies rather than weapons. This was not a war party. But what then? The lead riders guided their horses to stop at respectful distance from her cabin, perhaps 50 yards, maintaining position while a smaller group advanced. Clara recognized the central figure immediately despite the formal regalia he now wore. Soaring Hawk sat his horse with ceremonial bearing significantly different from the wounded messenger she had nursed through winter storms. Beside him rode an elder whose elaborate dress and bearing suggested high tribal authority, and several other Apache whose positions indicated leadership roles. With trembling hands but straight posture, Clara stepped outside her cabin to meet them. Soaring Hawk dismounted first, approaching with measured steps. When he spoke, his voice carried formal weight intended for both her and the assembled witnesses. "Clara Whitmore, we greet you in peace and gratitude. I present Wise Crow, principal chief of our band, who wishes to acknowledge actions that preserved tribal communications when winter threatened lives and alliances." The elder, Wise Crow, dismounted with dignity despite obvious age. His weathered face held kind eyes that studied Clara with careful assessment before he stepped forward, Soaring Hawk providing translation. "Wind speaks truth," the elder said, using what was apparently her Apache name. "Your shelter preserved more than one life during harsh winter. Messages carried by our messenger reached all bands safely, enabling peaceful coordination rather than scattered resistance. Tribal Council voted to honor such courage as tradition demands." Clara felt overwhelmed by the formal nature of this acknowledgement and the implications of having an entire tribal delegation at her homestead. "I acted as anyone should when finding someone in need during winter storms. No special recognition is necessary." Soaring Hawk translated her response, but Wise Crow smiled and shook his head gently before replying. "Humility confirms wisdom. Yet tradition requires acknowledgement of bridge building between peoples. You risked much to preserve Apache communications. Now we honor such courage in the traditional way." At some signal Clara didn't detect, the assembled Apache began dismounting and organizing with practiced efficiency. Groups moved toward different tasks, some to establish a temporary camp, others to organize what appeared to be gift presentations, and several to prepare what might be ceremonial activities. Clara watched in amazement as her isolated homestead transformed into a hub of controlled activity. The Apache worked with remarkable coordination, treating her land with careful respect while establishing camp structures that appeared both temporary and substantial. Soaring Hawk approached privately, while the elder supervised wider preparations. "You seem surprised by our presence," he observed. I never imagined such a response. When you left, I assumed our paths had diverged permanently. Winter experiences create obligations that extend beyond individual lives. Your actions preserved tribal unity that might have fragmented without communication networks. This gathering represents gratitude from 7 bands who benefited from successful message delivery. The enormity of this revelation struck Clara forcefully. Her week of providing shelter to 1 wounded Apache had contributed to coordinated peace efforts involving hundreds of tribal members. The implications extended far beyond her simple act of humanitarian assistance. "How many people?" she asked, gesturing toward the organized camp taking shape. 70 adults, perhaps 30 children. Representatives from each band were affected by winter message delivery. The Travois carry gifts selected specifically for your household, practical items, ceremonial offerings, and celebrations of successful alliance maintenance. As if summoned by his words, a group of Apache women approached, carrying the first of many items unpacked from heavily laden travois. Blankets of extraordinary craftsmanship, baskets so finely woven they appeared capable of holding water, pottery with designs Clara had never seen, dried meats prepared with herbs, creating unfamiliar but pleasant aromas. "This is too much," Clara protested as items continued accumulating. "I can't possibly accept such wealth for what I considered basic human decency." Wise Crow, who apparently understood more English than he initially revealed, addressed her directly. "Tradition requires balance. Gift received demands gift returned. Your winter shelter saved tribal unity. Our gifts preserve connection between peoples. This creates an obligation to maintain understanding rather than return to fear." The afternoon progressed with an organized ceremony that impressed Clara with its sophistication. Apache children performed songs, while women demonstrated various crafts, teaching Clara techniques for working with materials included in the gift collection. Men established shooting competitions and horse displays that showcase skills while providing entertainment. Most remarkable was the communal meal preparation. Traditional Apache foods combined with supplies Clara provided created a feast that filled her yard with tempting aromas. She found herself participating actively, learning, laughing occasionally, and gradually becoming less overwhelmed by the unprecedented gathering. During the meal, Wise Crow formally addressed both Apache and Clara together, establishing the purpose beyond gift-giving. This gathering creates a new path. White woman preserves Apache communications. Apache return preserves understanding. Together, we show both peoples that individuals shape history more than governments or armies. The political implications were unmistakable. This public demonstration of cross-cultural appreciation occurred in full view of any settlers or military personnel who might be observing. Clara understood. She had become unwillingly but irrevocably associated with tribal diplomatic initiatives. As evening approached, the Apache began preparing for departure. They would camp nearby for the night, but planned early morning return to their scattered camps before federal authorities could interpret the gathering as threatening. Soaring Hawk approached Clara during these preparations, his formal demeanor softening to the familiar communication they had developed during their winter together. "The Council wishes you to know that tribal scouts will maintain awareness of your welfare," he informed her. "Not intrusive surveillance, but protective watch. Your actions created an alliance that extends beyond individual friendship." Such protection might actually increase official suspicion, Clara observed, showing her growing understanding of frontier politics. Perhaps, but protection serves multiple purposes. Scouts can also provide early warning about civilian vigilante activities and monitor military movements that might affect civilian safety. This revelation of an intelligence network that now included her homestead both reassured and concerned Clara. She had moved from isolated neutrality to active participation in intertribal relations. "Will I see you again?" she asked, voicing the personal question underlying broader political considerations. Traditional messenger routes include this region seasonally, If circumstances permit peaceful travel, yes. Our friendship represents a successful bridge between worlds. Such connections require maintenance. Before departing, Wise Crow presented Clara with a final gift, a beautifully decorated pipe with carved stone bowl and intricate beadwork adorning its wooden stem. Through Soaring Hawk, he explained its significance. This pipe participates in council ceremonies. Your possession indicates adopted status within tribal diplomatic networks. Not full membership, but a recognized ally whose counsel might be sought during important decisions affecting both peoples. The weight of such recognition momentarily overwhelmed Clara. From an isolated widow to adopted tribal ally represented a transformation she couldn't have imagined during those first desperate moments discovering a dying Apache outside her cabins. The delegation prepared for withdrawal. Soaring Hawk offered final words that carried both gratitude and prophecy. Your example demonstrates possibility. Individual courage creates paths that governments can't see or won't attempt. Some on both sides will disapprove of your association with tribal people. Others will recognize its strategic value. History judges such actions differently than contemporary fears predict. The Apache departed as organizedly as they had arrived, leaving Clara standing in her yard, surrounded by evidence of the afternoon's remarkable events. Gifts beyond her cabin's capacity, food preparations showing combined cultures, and tracks of 70 horses marking her land as neutral ground where dramatic diplomacy had occurred. As sunset painted the western sky, Clara moved among the accumulated gifts, touching each item and contemplating its significance. Each object represented not just personal gratitude, but political statement. Her private act of winter assistance had been transformed into a public declaration of cross-cultural possibility. That evening, alone again, but with her perspective permanently altered, Clara composed another letter. This time, she wrote to her sister Ruth in Pennsylvania, describing not just recent events, but broader implications of what had occurred. "Dear Ruth," she began, "you asked in your last letter how I manage isolation so far from civilization. I've discovered that civilization means different things to different peoples. Today, 70 Apache traveled significant distance to acknowledge basic kindness shown during winter emergency. Their gifts represent more than gratitude. They demonstrate that understanding between supposed enemies remains possible when individuals choose human decency over fear. I share this not to distress you with concerns about my safety, but to illustrate that frontier life offers opportunities for building bridges that Eastern society might never provide. Yes, dangers exist, but so do possibilities for creating peace through individual action. The young Apache messenger I mentioned previously returned as part of today's delegation. He has become a friend across cultural boundaries that others insist must remain impassable. Perhaps such friendships represent the best hope for preventing larger conflicts that benefit no one except those who profit from perpetual fear. As Clara continued writing, she recognized how profoundly her worldview had expanded. The isolation she had accepted after Thomas's death had been replaced by connection to something larger than personal grief or cultural isolation. Her cabin would never again feel quite as solitary. Even after the Apache had disappeared beyond the horizon, their presence had altered the landscape permanently. Gift items throughout her home served as daily reminders of unexpected alliance. More significantly, the knowledge that tribal scouts maintained protective awareness created a sense of extended community she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Over the following weeks, Clara noticed subtle changes in how local settlers interacted with her. Some, like Marcus Fletcher, approached with curiosity about the Apache gathering others had observed. A few treated her with newfound wariness, as if association with tribal people had marked her as potentially dangerous. Most interestingly, Lieutenant Hayes visited 3 weeks after the delegation, not with official investigation, but with personal interest. Over coffee, he admitted that military intelligence had observed the entire gathering through distant field glasses. "Never seen anything quite like it," he confided. "Traditional gift-giving ceremony, combined with diplomatic statement. Superior officers debated whether to intervene, but ultimately decided against interrupting clearly peaceful activities." "Did it affect military assessment of tribal intentions?" Clara asked directly. "Difficult to say definitively. Some commanders interpret any organized tribal gathering as potential threat. Others recognize this as evidence that communication channels remain open. Your association with tribal messenger certainly influenced the peaceful reading of the event." Hayes paused, choosing words carefully. "Off the record, Mrs. Whitmore, your actions may have prevented escalation toward unnecessary conflict. Tribal unity preserved through successful message delivery avoided fracturing that might have led to desperate actions. That's not an official military assessment, just personal observation from someone who's seen fear drive both sides toward violence." 2 months after the Apache delegation, Clara received unexpected visitors. 3 women from Fort Apache settlement, led by Martha Williamson, the doctor's wife. They arrived with carefully prepared food and an obvious purpose. "Clara," Martha began after settling in Clara's main room, "we've heard various accounts of your situation with Apache messengers and tribal gatherings. We wanted to hear directly from you what occurred." Clara recognized this as significant. These women represented Fort Apache's established social leadership. Their visit marked either attempt to ostracize her from white female society or, more hopefully, genuine interest in understanding unprecedented events. She recounted her experiences honestly but diplomatically, emphasizing humanitarian necessity during winter emergency and resulting unexpected cultural education. As she spoke, Clara noticed the women's reactions shifting from initial disapproval toward grudging respect. "So you provided basic medical care and shelter," Martha summarized, "and this evolved into broader cultural understanding beneficial to both peoples?" "Essentially, yes. Though I never intended such consequences, events developed beyond individual control once basic assistance was provided." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with these frontier women showing surprising sophistication in discussing intertribal politics and the role individual actions might play in broader territorial peace. "There's talk of establishing more formal communication channels between settlers and tribal leaders," Martha confided, as they prepared to leave. "Your experience suggests such initiatives might prevent misunderstandings that lead to conflict. Individual connections often create a foundation for broader understanding," Clara agreed. "Fear diminishes when people recognize shared humanity." After they departed, Clara felt that another barrier had been crossed. Acceptance by respectable Fort Apache women meant her actions, while unusual, had gained legitimacy within settler society. Rather than pariah status, she was developing a reputation as someone who had successfully navigated cross-cultural challenge. Spring advanced toward summer, with Clara integrating lessons learned through her winter experience. The garden flourished, under attention, informed by Apache agricultural knowledge. Items from the gift delegation proved extraordinarily useful. Baskets that revolutionized her storage capabilities. Blankets that provided warmth beyond anything she had previously owned, and tools designed with efficiency she now incorporated into daily work. 6 months after the Apache delegation, a final validation arrived. Captain Morrison himself appeared at her door with a small military escort, carrying official correspondence. With a military seal, "Mrs. Whitmore," he announced formally, "I bring communication from Territorial Command, acknowledging your contribution to maintaining peaceful relations during a potentially volatile winter period." The document, written in bureaucratic language that barely concealed significance, officially recognized her humanitarian assistance during extreme weather conditions as having contributed to successful intertribal communication that preserved regional stability. More remarkably, it included appointment as civilian consultant for Native American affairs, with nominal salary, and request that she remain available for advisory capacity regarding cultural sensitivity in frontier relations. Clara read the document twice, overwhelmed by its implications. Official military recognition of her actions provided validation beyond anything she had imagined. More importantly, it offered legitimate framework for continuing cross-cultural communication without legal jeopardy. "I'm honored," she told Morrison simply, understanding that acceptance obligated her to expanded role in frontier diplomacy. As summer deepened, Clara found herself occasionally hosting meetings between moderate settlers and tribal representatives seeking peaceful resolution to resource conflicts. Her cabin became unofficial neutral ground, where opposing perspectives could be voiced without immediate threat. Soaring Hawk visited twice during these months, bringing updates from tribal councils and seeking Clara's perspective on settler attitudes toward various Apache initiatives. Their friendship had evolved into partnership with broader implications for territorial peace. "Your winter kindness has created lasting change," he observed during his second visit. 7 bands now recognize the possibility of alliance with thoughtful white settlers. Military acknowledges the value of cultural intermediaries, even suspicious. Civilians see tangible benefits from communication over conflict. Individual actions echo beyond their initial intent, Clara replied, reflecting on how dramatically her isolated life had transformed. Choosing understanding over fear creates ripples that expand in unexpected directions. That evening, as Soaring Hawk prepared to continue his seasonal messenger route, they stood together watching sunset paint the western sky in brilliant colors. The landscape that had appeared so threatening during winter storms now showed its gentler aspects. Productive land that could support multiple communities if approached with wisdom rather than fear. "Your husband would be proud," Soaring Hawk said quietly. "His legacy continues through your courage in extending friendship where others see only danger." Thomas believed in building rather than destroying. I simply followed his example when circumstances demanded choice. As the Apache messenger disappeared once more into gathering darkness, Clara returned to her cabin, no longer an isolated outpost on civilization's edge, but a recognized bridge between worlds. The winter that should have claimed Soaring Hawk's life had instead created an alliance that would influence territory politics for years to come. 7 months after finding a near-frozen Apache outside her door, Clara Whitmore had become living, proof that individual courage could create understanding where institutional structures had built only division. The gifts that lined her cabin walls served as a daily reminder that small acts of humanity, when undertaken despite fear and social pressure, could reshape landscapes more effectively than armies or governments. Her future remained uncertain. Frontier. Life always carried unpredictable elements, but Clara faced whatever came with knowledge that she had chosen correctly when winter demanded a decision. Understanding over suspicion, humanity over convention, bridge building over barrier maintaining, these choices had created a community where isolation had existed, cooperation where conflict had threatened, and hope where fear had previously dominated. As summer stars emerged above her quiet homestead, Clara felt profound satisfaction in knowing that her winter experience had validated principles both Thomas and her own conscience had long held true. Sometimes The most important actions required simply doing what conscience demanded, regardless of social expectations or political pressures. The Apache stone-carving soaring hawk had given her caught lamplight from her table, its patterns flowing like water while remaining constant like stone. Wind and water, forces of change and persistence combined, had indeed reshaped her landscape, both literal and metaphorical. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Clara rested with certainty that her choices had honored both her deceased husband's memory and the unexpected friendship that had emerged from winter's harsh demands. In the end, she reflected, humanity's greatest victories often came not from dramatic conquests, but from quiet decisions to extend help when others counseled fear. The 70 Apache riders with 30 loaded Travois had provided visible proof of what individual courage could accomplish, but the real transformation occurred in less dramatic moments: shared meals, exchanged knowledge, and bridges built across boundaries that too many considered insurmountable. As sleep approached, Clara's last conscious thought was gratitude for the storm that had forced such extraordinary education. Sometimes, she now understood, life's most important lessons arrived disguised as emergencies, requiring immediate action before prudence could intervene. Her winter's greatest gift had been discovering that individual courage could create understanding, where conventional wisdom insisted only conflict was possible. That discovery would guide her through whatever challenges frontier life might yet present, and it had made her small cabin in Arizona territory a place where two worlds had touched, and both had been enriched by the connection. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.